Van Gogh's ear, Plath's oven, Hemingway's gun. You know these images. You've seen them on posters, in documentaries, in the way we talk about creativity itself, the artist suffering in a garret, the genius burning too bright to survive, the idea that real art comes from real pain. We've been told this story so many times that it feels like truth. That suffering is the price of brilliance. That madness and genius are twins. That if you're not tortured, you're not real. This isn't just wrong, it's actively harmful. Where did this myth come from? Why do we keep telling it? To find out, don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and share it with your friends. The story starts in ancient Greece. Plato wrote about divine madness, the idea that artists and poets were possessed by something beyond themselves. Their creativity came from the gods. It wasn't a choice, it was a visitation. But here's what's interesting. Plato wasn't saying madness was required. He was trying to explain why creativity felt different from ordinary thinking. The madness was metaphor. The divine was a way of acknowledging that something mysterious happens when we make things. Somewhere along the way, metaphor became prescription. By the 19th century, the Romantic era, suffering had become a credential. Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, Keats dying young of tuberculosis. The more tortured you were, the more authentic your art seemed. Seneca's ancient aphorism became gospel. No great genius has existed without a touch of madness. Notice what happened. The observation that some artists suffered became the assumption that artists must suffer. Description became prescription. And the myth became invisible because it was everywhere. Now think about how this plays out today. Biopics about tortured artists, magazine profiles that emphasize the darkness, social media aesthetics built around suffering as proof of depth. The myth isn't just still here, it's become content. It's become merchandise. Here's a question no one asks about the tortured artist myth. Who profits from it? When Van Gogh was alive, he sold perhaps one painting, maybe two, 400 francs. He died believing he had failed. In 2022, a single Van Gogh sold at auction for $117 million. Dead artists don't negotiate. They don't demand royalties. They don't produce more work that might flood the market. Scarcity drives price, and nothing creates scarcity like death. Van Gogh's fame wasn't inevitable. It was constructed. His sister-in-law, Johanna van Gogh Bonga, inherited his paintings after his brother Theo died. She spent decades organizing exhibitions, editing his letters, building the narrative of the misunderstood genius. Without her, Van Gogh might be a footnote. Which version of Van Gogh sells more posters? The insurance company clerk who painted on weekends and slowly built a career? Or the mad genius who cut off his ear and shot himself in a wheat field? One version sells merchandise. The other version is just a person. Research actually suggests that the death effect, the idea that art prices spike when an artist dies, is mostly myth. Prices often rise in the years before death, when collectors anticipate scarcity. After death, prices frequently drop as estates flood the market. But we remember the exceptions because they fit the story we want to believe. Van Gogh, Basquiat. The myth feeds itself. Here's what the evidence actually shows when you look at individual cases instead of the mythology. Van Gogh produced 150 paintings during the year he spent at the asylum in Saint-Rémy. But almost none of them were made during his actual episodes. He painted between the crises, not during them. His most famous work, The Starry Night, came from a period of relative stability. He wrote that he wanted his paintings to rest the mind, not to capture madness, but to fight it. Sylvia Plath wrote some of the most celebrated poems in English during the final months of her life, but she arranged her final collection to end with spring, with survival, with bees tasting warmth after winter. Her husband rearranged it to end with death, because that version fit the myth. Her creativity wasn't a symptom of her dissent, it was her weapon against it. Franz Kafka was an insurance lawyer who wrote at night, after work, after exhaustion, because writing was the only thing that made him feel alive. He was editing a story about starvation while literally starving to death from tuberculosis. His creativity wasn't born from his suffering, it was born against it. Every page was an act of defiance. 3 artists, different centuries, different mediums, different struggles. And the same truth running through all of them. They didn't create because they suffered, they created despite suffering. The art was the survival, not the symptom. But this isn't just about dead artists in history books. It's about something closer. Maybe you've withheld help from yourself, told yourself you needed to suffer more before you'd earned anything. That getting help was somehow cheating. That real creativity meant pushing through alone, without medication, without therapy, without support. That's not discipline. That's the myth eating you. The tortured artist myth is easiest to romanticize when you're comfortable. When suffering is something that happens to other people, dead people, famous people, people safely contained in biographies. It's harder to romanticize when you're the one who can't get out of bed. There's a problem with learning from tortured artists. It's called survivorship bias. We only hear from the ones who lived long enough to complete work. The ones who didn't survive don't get biographies. For every Van Gogh who produced 2,000 works before dying at 37, how many artists died at 25 with nothing finished? How many never started at all? We don't know their names. We can't learn from their example because there's no example to learn from. The myth hurts young artists who believe they need to suffer to be authentic. Art students who romanticize poverty because they think struggle is required. Creators who avoid treatment because they're afraid medication will flatten their creativity. Research actually shows the opposite. Studies of artists treated for bipolar disorder found that the majority became more productive after treatment, not less. The most severe episodes don't produce the best work. They produce nothing. The creativity happens in the spaces between crises. And here's what the myth gets most wrong. Mental illness is not a choice. It's not a credential. It's not something you earn through being sufficiently artistic. It's random. It's moral luck. Some people get it, some don't. The talent was never located in the suffering. The talent existed alongside the suffering, fighting against it, sometimes winning and sometimes losing. Let me tell you a different story. Van Gogh painted to rest his mind. Plath wrote to survive the winter. Kafka created worlds because the one he lived in wasn't enough. They weren't tortured artists. They were artists who happened to be in pain. And the art was their way of fighting back. Art can be a survival tool. It can be therapy. It can be the reason you get through another day. But it doesn't require suffering as fuel. The suffering is the obstacle. The art is what happens when you overcome it, or at least when you survive long enough to try. The tortured artist myth serves galleries, biographers, and merch companies. It doesn't serve artists. It doesn't serve people struggling with mental illness. It doesn't serve anyone trying to make something meaningful while also trying to stay alive. Great art can happen alongside suffering, not because of it, alongside. The next time someone tells you about a tortured genius, ask a different question. Don't ask what their suffering produced. Ask what they might have made if they hadn't suffered. Ask what we lost. Ask who's still alive, making things, and how we can help them stay that way.